If you think back about amazing and great stories that you've heard, you hear stories, inspiring stories of great sacrifice, where a hero lays down his life or someone lays down their life so that the hero can conquer. And in those moments, we remember it and we say, oh, wow, that's amazing. Oh, that's fantastic. I want to be more like that. We feel inspired to be like that. Whether it's old westerns or any other story from years and years, centuries gone by, or the most recent book that dropped on the New York Times bestseller list, probably, if you look at it, you'll see a story of a hero where it looks like all is lost. Right? In the old comics, it was the person, the hero, or the beautiful girl is laying tied up on the railroad tracks, right? And they're saying to the villain, "You'll never get away with this." And the villain says, "I already have." And the train is coming around the corner, right? And the smoke is blowing out of the smokestack, and the engineer puts on the brakes, but he'll never stop in time. But at the last moment, faster than a speeding bullet, right? Look in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. Right? Or the guy wearing the white hat comes riding up, right? I think some of you guys must have this must be a thing from your past. You're like, oh, you were wearing a white hat when you rode up on your... Oh, okay. There we go. There it is. All right. He rode on his motorcycle and he's wearing a white hat. So, why do all these stories resonate? Why do they echo in our hearts and bounce around in our heads? Let me tell you why. Because there is a hero. There is a hero. And I'm talking about not the hero with the little capital H. I'm talking about the hero with the little h. I'm talking about the hero with the capital H. There is a hero above all other heroes who rides in to save the day, who, when it looks like he is down for the count for the final time, he gets up. Yeah. This is the highest day of the whole Christian year. The highest and best day of all of the Christian year is this day. In fact, if you took the Christian faith and you boiled it all down, a lot of other faiths, when you boil them down, they come down to a set of teachings, like a set of values, of teachings. Islam, you boil it all down and it comes down to a set of teachings. You pray, you make a pilgrimage, you keep Allah's rules, right? It's a set of teachings. It's a book, the Quran. If you boil down a lot of other faiths, you'll come down to the sayings of Confucius or what Buddha taught or all these. But the Christian faith does not boil itself down just to a book, because that book doesn't tell us a set of ways to live. It tells us a story of a person. And it tells us not only a story of a person, but it tells a story of a person in a particular event in history that all of history hinges around. And that one event is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The only reason you should listen to me today, the only reason you should hear what is said, is not because Jesus was a good teacher or because his sayings work, or though they do. It's not because he was a good teacher, although he was. It's not because he claimed this or he claimed. It's because he rose on the third day. That's why you should listen. If you're taking notes this morning, I want to tell you, if you're following along on the handout, if you didn't get one, look around. Maybe there's so you can get a hold of one from somebody. There's a pen there around you somewhere. Jesus' resurrection Jesus' resurrection was predicted. It was predicted. Now, I said the other day that predictions, people that make predictions are a dime a dozen. Have you seen these little banner ads on the bottom of stories that you read? The man who predicted the crash in 2008 is making another prediction. Have you seen these, right? What are they saying? They're saying he said something was going to happen, and it happened. That should lend some authority, right, to what he's saying now. Jesus' resurrection was predicted. The prophets predicted it. If you're taking notes, Hosea chapter 6, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence." Always the Christians looked back at that prophecy and said, "Oh, that's what he was talking about." Psalm 16, 9 and 10, my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. And the third day, Jesus walks out alive. Jesus, not only did the prophets predict it, but Jesus predicted it himself. He predicted it himself. Matthew 12:40, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Here's a little historical curiosity for you. Are you ready? Incidentally, we don't know for 100% sure that Jesus was crucified on Friday. We don't. It's true. It could have been Thursday, possibly could have been Wednesday, but it's not said in the Scripture. It just says that he was crucified, and then after that, after they took him off the cross, they rested because they were hurried, because it was preparation day for the Sabbath. And so Saturday, being the Jewish Sabbath from the Old Testament system, they've said, well, maybe this must have been Friday. That's kind of the traditional view, but it could have been. And some people say, well, 3 days and 3 nights, he couldn't be in the grave for 3 nights if it was, and then rise on Sunday morning. We do know it was the first day of the week when he rose. So here's what I'm here to say. Who cares? It's okay. The Scripture didn't say. I don't have to make dogmatic claims either direction. What I do know is this. Jesus died. Jesus died. And on the third day, on Sunday morning, first day of the week, the tomb was empty. And he rose again. Jesus predicted it. At Mark 8:31 also, he began to teach them, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He predicted it. Now, you could predict your own death, right? You could do that. You could be like, I just feel like maybe I'm going to die. And it might come true, right? It could. But if you said, like I've heard of some people doing that before, I just feel like I'm not going to make it past a certain time, and they don't, right? You've heard of that. People die. But if they predicted their own resurrection, that's a whole different thing. Like, that's not normal. That doesn't happen every other day. Jesus said, I'm going to die, and on the third day, rise again. Jesus predicted his resurrection. Number 2, Jesus' resurrection was proof of his power and his claims. It was proof of his power and his claims. Romans chapter 1, verse 4, who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. The Christians always believed this. From the first and earliest days, this was the message they preached. Jesus has risen again, and that proves he is who he said he is. Let me give you 5 reasons why you should believe Jesus really was shown to be the Son of God with power on this day. Are you ready? I share this, maybe not every Easter, but almost every Easter, and here's why. Because it matters so deeply. It is important that you understand that your faith does not rest upon some kind of shifting foundation of feelings and ooey-gooey feelings about a guy that died 2,000 years ago and, I feel pretty good about it. Your faith does not rest on those kind of things. Your faith does not rest on, I hope so, maybe so, somebody once told me, Grandma, I think, believed. It doesn't rest on any of those things. Your faith rests on the foundation of Jesus rising from the dead. If he rose, everything has changed. If he didn't rise, your faith is worthless. It is. It's worthless. We're wasting our time. We could all be doing something else if Jesus did not rise. So let me prove to you, let me tell you why I believe the resurrection. Jesus rose from the dead. Here's why. H-E-A-R-T. See it? Heart. Horrible death. Jesus died a horrible death. And it was definite that he died. Now, in the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, it sold like 40 million copies and they made it into a movie. So you start having to deal with that in the culture when it happens. 40 million copies of the book, and the book alleges that Jesus did not die on the cross, that somehow he survived the cross. They took him down and he ran away with Mary Magdalene, got married, and moved to France. I'm not joking. That's literally what it claims. Never mind that the historical documents that allege this, and there are some historical documents that they have found, were written hundreds of years after Jesus died and rose. Right? The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, those are Gnostic writings from hundreds of years after Christ rose, after Christ died and rose. So they're writing, it's like me making up something about actually George Washington, 200 and however many years ago it was now. George Washington actually was a female. And you're like, prove it. You see, you can't say that. It's history, right? You got writings, and if I make new writings, I'm a long ways from the actual events. It doesn't count. It doesn't count. But these writings that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are written very, very close to the original dates. Many of them, they have found fragments of these writings, fragments of actual copies in Alexandria, Egypt, hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, that date back to within 75 years. Fragments, copies. That means the originals were even earlier, that date back to within 75 years of Jesus dying on the cross. Now, if there's a fragment in Egypt of a copy, what we're in now is we're back in, it pushes it back into the eyewitness period, and people saw Jesus die. Professional Roman executioners killed him. The cross was a horrific way to die. Incidentally, I talked to the youth group a couple nights ago on Good Friday, and I talked to them about the crucifixion, the idea of crucifixion. We take for granted a symbol like the cross because it's so common now. If we say the symbol of our faith is the cross, I could say that and nobody would gasp. Nobody would be like, But if I said that 2,000 years ago, now the symbol of the religion that I'd like to begin is the cross. Everybody would be like, why? And the reason is, it was the most brutal form of execution the Romans could come up with. If they really wanted to make an example out of you, they didn't chop your head off. If they really wanted to make an example out of you, they didn't stab you or anything like that. They crucified you. And the reason was this: crucifixion, the arms would be stretched out. A Roman soldier, executioner, they were professionals. They did this all the time. They would take your arms and pull outward until they stretched, sometimes separating the shoulder joints. And then they would drive a nail, not through here, because this would tear too easily. This was considered part of the hand in the ancient world. They would drive a nail through that portion of the hand because the bones and ligaments and would hold it together. Also, all of the nerves that give your hand all of its feeling run right through the middle of that wrist joint right there. It would crush that set of nerves and cause incredible excruciating pain. In fact, the word excruciating comes from a Latin word that means out of the cross. They would stretch that person out, and literally now, if you, I won't ask you to do it this morning, but if you stretched yourself out as far as you could, what happens is your rib cage lifts and stretches, and you can't breathe deeply. When you're hanging by your arms, you can't breathe deeply. And so literally, the pain and the shock and the stretched and the would literally cause you to choke to death over the course of time. The only way you could breathe was to be able to relieve the pressure on your arms and your rib cage by lifting yourself up. And so to make sure it was possible but as painful as they could, they would nail your feet to the cross as well. So the only way you could breathe was by pressing upward and lifting yourself up until exhaustion and shock and all things and tired and pain would cause you to slump back down and you'd barely be able to breathe again. Depending on the strength of the person being crucified, it could go on for days. At one time, the Romans crucified 1,200 followers of Spartacus, the rebel who gathered an army together and rebelled against Rome. And they would go every couple hundred yards and crucify another person. 120 miles of crucifixion. Imagine, from here to, if you're in Oklahoma City, past Tulsa, 120 miles, we haven't finished passing the people crucified. They did this all the time. Professionals. My friends, Jesus did not get down off the cross and make it through. He did not survive the cross and get down. Jesus was brutally murdered on the cross, and he died. His disciples took his body down and wrapped him up in 75, in those days it was customary, about 75 pounds of spices and burial cloths. If he wasn't dead, he was now. They wrap you up and wrap your body tightly and smear a spice mixture on it and wrap tightly around and around and around your body. Jesus was placed into a borrowed tomb, a tomb of a rich man. A rich man, two men, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph was a wealthy man who was a believer. And he came and asked for the body, and he put it in his own tomb. Now, the reason that's important is because the tomb 3 days later was empty. And there is a theory that some people, skeptics, have tried to say, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. All the disciples went to the wrong tomb. The women went to the wrong tomb. It was kind of early in the morning, kind of almost, the sun was just barely coming up. It was partly dark, and they went to the wrong tomb. They saw an empty tomb, and they were like, he's alive! And the only problem with that is Joseph of Arimathea, it was his tomb. You'd think he'd know. Wealthy people would have their tombs carved out of solid rock. If it was a poor person, a homeless person like Jesus was, they'd just throw the body on the city dump. But Jesus, his disciples, and Joseph of Arimathea gather him, they wrap him in spices, and they place him in this borrowed tomb. And so Jesus didn't walk out of the city dump. He walked out of a tomb as was predicted by the prophets. Now, if you're taking notes, E is a very, very important, empty tomb. Empty tomb. You see, the one thing everybody agrees on is that the tomb was empty. Everybody agrees. The Jews said the tomb was empty. They just came up with a story for why it was empty, right? They said the disciples stole the body. Talk about that one in a minute. Other people said wrong tomb, but everybody agreed that the tomb was empty. If the tomb had not been empty, all the Jews had to do was bring out the body. The tomb was empty. They couldn't bring out the body. They couldn't stop the stories because they couldn't bring out the body. The tomb was empty. The A is this: appearances after the resurrection. This Jesus, who was witnessed to be brutally murdered, was dead, was wrapped in spices and linens and placed in a borrowed tomb. A huge stone was rolled in the way, and on the third day the stone was rolled away. The tomb was empty, and Jesus was seen by people alive. Some of the same people, many of the same people who saw him crucified. Appearances after the resurrection. Anybody know how many people did Jesus appear to after the resurrection? Anybody know? Over 500. The disciples, 2 on the road to Emmaus. The disciples several times. He appeared a second time to Thomas, who doubted, remember, at first, whether he was really alive. And Jesus came back and said, Thomas, here, see, you feel that right there? Yeah. And then he said, Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, right? That's a blessed person. Now, the appearances after the resurrection, over 500 people at one time saw Jesus alive. The R is this, record of women as the first witnesses. Women as the first witnesses. Now you say, now why is that important? Well, the reason is because nobody who was trying to fool the world and trying to create a false story of a crucifixion in order to gain followers, nobody would have picked women as the first witnesses. Now, before you start getting all mad about it, all right, I hear you, Dan. Before you get all mad about it, let me explain. In these days, women were held to be unreliable. Now, we know that's not true. Amen. Thank you, men. All right. Lady, I thought I'd get some female amens, but that's all right. We know that's not true, but in these days, women could not even serve as witnesses in court. If you saw something, it had to be a man that saw it to be able to testify in court. Now, ask yourself this question. If you are a disciple and you're like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to fake a story about Jesus rising, and I'm going to start a religion and gather some followers. Would you pick people who couldn't be court witnesses even? They weren't even allowed? No, you wouldn't. The record of women as the first witnesses is a powerful, powerful proof in this day that Jesus really was alive. Because the only way they would put it this way is if it happened just like that. T, the last one, is the transformation of the disciples. The transformation of the disciples. Chuck Colson. Anybody ever know who Chuck Colson is? He passed away recently. Chuck Colson is a Christian author. He was not always a Christian. Chuck Colson was Richard Nixon's hatchet man. He was his man that would do the dirty work, get stuff done, make sure that the behind-the-scenes stuff happened. Chuck Colson was a ruthless political operative. He was responsible for making sure everybody was on the same page and everybody was repeating the same story and everybody was, the narrative was together. In the days after the Watergate scandal, Chuck Colson was one of only a very few people who actually did prison time over Watergate. When the Watergate scandal broke and Richard Nixon and his people, including Chuck Colson, tried to cover it up, Nixon was pardoned, but a few other people actually did some prison time because of their work and their role in the Watergate scandal. Chuck Colson went to prison for Watergate. While he was in prison, God changed his life. Absolutely revolutionary. He became a real Christian. Later on, in fact, he wrote later on, he said, while I was in prison, I began to consider the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And he said, as I read the stories of the disciples and what they did after the resurrection, and their courage and their boldness, and they didn't care. They just went out and preached the story. They preached the message. Jesus is alive. And many of them, all of them, were either put to death or beaten or thrown into prison. They lost their jobs. They lost family. They lost relationships. They lost their status and influence. They were hunted and chased down. And he said, not one of them, out of the apostles that followed Jesus and knew him best, not one of them turned their backs and said, I admit, we made it all up. Not one. Every one of them died saying, Jesus is alive. And he said, as I looked at that, he said, I concluded, he said, there were only 3 or 4 or 5 people who even knew about the Watergate scandal. There were only a few people, the inner circle, who even knew. He said, but as soon as the prosecutors came in and started nosing around and offering people deals, people cracked, just like that. The lie couldn't hold. When their skin was on the line, when it was their jail time they were facing, and the prosecutor was saying, listen, I'll make you a deal. I'll cut you a deal. They'll go to prison. You tell me what they did. They'll go to prison. I'll let you off easy. He said as soon as the deal started being made, people started giving up. The lie cracked. He said, we couldn't hold it together for a week. And he said, these guys held it together for the rest of their life. And he said, the conclusion I came to is there's only one possibility, and that is Jesus was alive. They saw him. It really happened. You see, just a few weeks before this, anybody remember the story of Peter? Just a few weeks before they started preaching and talking about Jesus being alive, just a few weeks before, Peter is standing there at a distance, warming his hands by the fire in the courtyard at the high priest's place. And over there on the other side of the courtyard is Jesus and the crowd around him, and they are trying him. And a little servant girl comes up and says in the firelight to Peter, I recognize you. Why, you were with Jesus in the garden, weren't you? And you know what Peter said? He denied it. He said, I don't know the man. I just happened to be here. Just a little bit later, another one comes back. The same thing happens. The third time, a man says, I can recognize your accent. You're a Galilean. You're from the same area as Jesus. There's no way you're just here from out of town. You were with Jesus. I know you were. And Peter began to curse and swear and say, I don't know that man. And the same Peter, 50 days later, is standing up in front of a crowd of thousands in the street in Jerusalem, the same city where all this happened. And he's preaching and says, you killed the Son of God, Jesus, but God raised him from the dead. And now, what are you going to do about it? Is this the same guy? What happened? Let me tell you what happened. He lost his fear because Jesus was alive. We sang a while ago, life is worth the living just because he lived. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. What can they do to you? What's the worst that they can do? Kill you? Oh yeah. Let me tell you about that. You kill me and I just come back to life. Yeah, I mean, that's like, you kill me and I just go live in heaven. It's a difficult thing, but hey. It's a hard life, right? But somebody's got to live it. You kill me and I get to come back to life and live in heaven. Tough for you, right? You're not scared anymore. Romans, let me give you the next blank there. So here's the thing. Jesus really did rise from the dead, and you have to deal with this. Okay, this morning, you have to deal with this as an historical fact, not one man's opinion. Okay, this is not Darrell's opinion, or the Apostle Peter's opinion, or even just the opinion of some other people around you here in this church today, or even a whole bunch of people in Oklahoma City. All the churches, it's not just our opinion. You have to deal with this and face up to this issue as a fact of history. Jesus came back to life. Now, what you do with that is your choice. But you do have to face up to the fact that it happened. And it really is something that took place in history. Number three. Jesus' resurrection is a call to you. Believe and obey. Believe and obey. Now, in Romans chapter 5, right after Paul said he was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, the next verse is what's there on your handout. Through him, and for his name's sake, we have received grace and apostleship. Paul was an apostle, which means a sent one, a messenger, to call people from among all the Gentiles, that's us, not Jews alone, but all Gentiles, to call people from among all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. And you also are among those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. Look at your neighbor and say, you're among the called. Jesus is calling you. That's right. You're among the called. You're not left out. Now, here's the other thing. I want you to understand, not only is that person next to you called, but you're called. And you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. And you, 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 and you. And I could keep going, but you get the point. It's for you. Not somebody else out there somewhere, not somebody who's got the money, not somebody who's got the looks, not somebody who's always picked first, not the guy who's got all the position and the power, not the governmental people or the people who have the beauty and the handsome feature. No, God's calling you. He's calling to you. And he says, you are among the called. So Jesus' resurrection is a call to you. Today is Grace Day. It's Grace Day. It's not Judgment Day. You see, Judgment Day is coming. Someday, you will stand before this Jesus who really died and really rose again from the dead. You'll stand before him and you'll look him in the eye. And you'll have to deal with the fact of what you did with him in your life. You will have to deal with that. He knows everything you've ever done, everything you'd love to hide from everybody else, everything if you're afraid that somebody here might someday find out about it, Jesus already knows. All right? But you know what? Today is not that day yet. Now it could be. We don't know when Christ will return. We don't know. I just know this, that between now and the day you stand before Jesus, you have an opportunity that is unspeakably amazing. Today, this Easter, is Grace Day. It is a day where Jesus is calling you, all of you who have messed up, all of you who have blown it, believe in Jesus and obey him. All of you who are drunkards or addicts, guess what? He's calling after you. All of you who have sinned and have fallen away from the Lord, all of you who have sinned against your marriage vows, he's calling you. Come, believe in me, Jesus says, and live a life of purity. All of those who have stolen something, Jesus is calling to you. If you're like me, something pops up in your mind, right? When you say that, oh no, yeah, I don't think about that. But guess what? Jesus is calling you anyway. Today he is calling all those who have cheated. Come, live a life of integrity. Follow me, believe in me, and live a life of integrity and honest work. Today he's calling all of those who have been greedy. He's calling out to you. And he's saying, come and believe in me and live a life of joy, contentment, and simplicity. Today he is calling out to drug dealers and drug users. Today he's calling out and saying, come, believe in me. Be free from sinning against others and dragging them into addiction. Today he's calling criminals. Come, believe in me. Stop your lawless activity. Today he's calling those who are young. Come, believe in me. Follow me. Turn your life now away from sin and turn it toward Jesus now while you're young. You teenagers, he's calling you. Come, believe in Jesus, follow after him, start now so that you don't look back 30 years from now with a heart of regret on a life that's been broken and wasted in sin. Follow me now. He's calling to you young married couples. He's calling to all of you. Start now. Build your marriage and your home and your family on the rock, Jesus Christ. He's calling those who are older. And he's saying it's not too late. Come and believe in me. It's not too late. Yes, years have gone. Yes, water has gone under the bridge, but it's not too late. Come. Come believe in me. Today he's calling to everyone who ever doubted. You have any doubters here today? Or you feel like, I don't know. I just don't know if, like, is it for me? Can I really do this? Can I really be that person? Yes, you can, but not by your own strength. It's going to take the one who rose from the dead, living in you. Jesus entered into death and destroyed death from the inside out so that you and me and everyone you know can come to an empty tomb and believe in the one who walked out alive and have him rise in your heart. You see, he's done this for everyone. I want you to notice it says in Romans 1:5, it says the obedience that comes from faith. That means that obedience is proof of faith. It flows out of faith. And I have to stop and say this. I have to stop and hit this because some of you would say, oh, I'm a person of great faith. But the truth is, you're going to walk out of here and do whatever you want. Am I making sense to you? You know people like that. Maybe you see one when you look in the mirror. You're going to say, oh, well, I mean, I've got faith. Yeah, I mean, I believe in God. You know what? The devil believes in God too. He does. He trembles at the thought of God. The question is, does your faith demonstrate itself in obedience? Because if it doesn't, is it worth anything? The Bible says faith without works is dead. Proof, faith. If you will not obey, then you do not believe. That's what the blanks are. I've just realized I didn't give them to you. If you will not obey, then you do not believe. That's the Bible's way. I'm not saying, well, I think it's probably true. That's not faith in the Bible. Faith is, I believe it is true and I rest my whole reality on it. I throw myself on it. I want to challenge you. You are not left out. You are among those who are called. You're not left out. You are included. You're included. And God calls you, and you and you and you, to the obedience that comes from faith. He calls you to a life lived in the service and the obedience of the one who marched out of the tomb alive. Amen. Would you bow your heads with me together and let's seek the Lord together in prayer?